tourism industry, one of those affected badly by the COVID-19 restrictions over the last 2 years. New data released by Stats SA says there's some light at the end of the tunnel as accommodation incomes are starting to rise. But the situation remains tenuous. International travel bans, the possibility of more restrictions in the domestic market still looming. Our business reporter, Kopano Gumbi, following the story for us. Kopano, good afternoon to you. This data from Statistics South Africa, it says accommodation incomes are rising, but this only goes up to October. What do the numbers tell us?
Absolutely, Stephen. So, it is looking like it may be a slightly better picture than it was last year. When we remember what we saw in the previous year, we were in a much stricter lockdown, and so there wasn't as much freedom of movement, and there was restrictions around traveling interprovincially even. And so now that that has been released or relieved slightly, we see that the income in accommodation especially has risen quite substantially. It's a 52% increase from last year to this year. But notably, and quite important for all of these places that have accommodation, is that the value of that is not yet at pre-pandemic levels. In fact, many of these companies, in order just to survive and to get through this difficult time, have found themselves having to slash prices slightly, offer discounts, extended stays, all sorts of measures just to make sure that they stay with their business and keep their business afloat. Now, following this data from Stats SA that we've seen, there's also an interesting development around occupancy rates, which is a big concern for many of these accommodations. Occupancy rates have been quite low, even though they are slowly recovering across the industry. Stats SA says up to October that all accommodations, including hotels, lodges, caravan parks, etc., only had occupancy rates averaging around 30%, which is not very positive for the entire industry and for smaller companies who hope that if the larger accommodations like hotels are fully booked, they get some of that catchment in people who are looking for a place to stay. But following that, I spoke to the CEO of the Tourism Business Council about this challenge around occupancy rates, and this is what he had to say.
The occupancy rate is not as what we wanted or what we expect. Is still very low. And we've got to look at the tourism infrastructure that we have in South Africa. Our infrastructure is bigger than what the domestic market can consume. And also, when we talk about the domestic market, there is still a large part of domestic market that's not happening. One, you don't have much of government travel. You don't have much of corporate travel. You don't have much of events happening. So in essence, we're relying on domestic leisure travel. When you don't have these three other aspects into the mix, you tend to have a picture that we're seeing now.
And Kopano, for years, people have been talking about how important tourism is, how many people it employs, how many people it could employ if it's done right.
Absolutely, Stephen. And, that's one of the biggest developments that came out of the President's Economic and Reconstruction Plan. If you remember, they had plans to boost tourism because it's an easy way to get people into employment in the tourism and hospitality space. What's very interesting from that clip that the CEO was just mentioning, I think is important to reiterate, that the accommodation available in South Africa, the hundreds and thousands of rooms, our domestic market cannot meet that capacity, unfortunately. And so they do rely on international travelers to come in. Without them, they're then relying on business. They're relying on business travel as well as government events, etc., none of which have been able to happen as these restrictions continue and as we see the number of COVID cases increasing. And so it's quite a difficult knock-on effect because many people look not just for full-time permanent employment during this busy December period, but they're also looking for some temporary employment. There's a lot of these companies that support tourism and the tourism industry that hire temporary workers during this time, and people are able to earn an income through that channel. And that also looks like it might be at risk if any other restrictions are put on us, Stephen.
Kopano Gumbi, really appreciate the update. Thanks very much indeed.